In this video, I'm going to show you the commands from the Pivot Fields and Items group on the PPP tab when you get the Pivot Power Premium add-in. This help file that I'm using you can get if you click Resources and go to the Help page. There's a download link for this sample file. The first command we'll look at is Clear Old Items. And that's just a single button here. There's no drop down. Just click that to run that command. And what it does is make sure that none of the old data is retained in your pivot table. So I'll go to this pivot table that has products in it. So we're going to be changing the name a bit. Instead of cheese, we'll call it cheesy. So if I go to my sales data and look for that product, there's just one here, so I'm going to change the name. And now cheese shouldn't show up in our pivot table anymore. If I go back to products and refresh, so now it shows up as cheesy. But if I look at the product drop-down list, it's still showing cheese here, and cheesy is way at the bottom. That's because it's remembering that even though I refreshed it, even though the item is showing up correctly here, it remembers that old data. Now if I click this button to clear old data, and then I'll refresh again, and now when I look, the cheese is gone and cheesy is still there at the bottom. Then the other two are pivot fields and pivot items. So we'll look at pivot fields first. And the two that I use most often at the top, and you probably will be interested in using, are the value headings. These are the ones that take the sum of or count of out of your headings and just leave the field name there with a space character at the end. So I can use this for selected fields or all the fields in the values area. So first I'll just do it on this one, order count. I just do selected and it takes the heading there, but it doesn't change these headings. If I use the one to change all three of them are changed. And if you look at one and click, you'll see that there's a little space character at the end because you can't use a heading here that's exactly the same as the field name. The next commands here include new items. This setting affects whether new items show up after you've done a manual filter. So if I come into product and uncheck some of these, that's a manual filter. So if I say don't show me saltines anymore. So it's hidden here, but now if I add a new cracker item to my sales data, if I refresh the pivot table, it won't show up here because it won't automatically appear in this manual filter. But if I change this setting to include new items, then it would appear in this list. The next command, clear all fields, simply does that. It takes everything out of the pivot table and you can rebuild it. The next two let you put a few fields into your pivot table layout and then add all the remaining ones to the values area or to the rows area. So now we could try this clear all fields. If I click that, gives me a fresh start. I could put region, category, and product into my pivot table, and now I've still got several that are unchecked, IDs unchecked, and I'm going to come in here and say add all to values. So anything that's left shows up here as a value. And then perhaps I don't really want the ID in, but I got a whole lot of fields in all at once, and now I can come back here and remove all selected value fields. So I can just take out that one very easily, or I could select 3 or 4 very easily. So with those combinations of commands, you can get a good start. Clear everything out, put a few in, dump the rest into values or rows, and then pick out a few that you really don't need in there. The last two here are for this field list at the right. Usually it's in source order, so whatever your columns are in your source data, they show up in that order. But if you've got a long list and you want it to be easier to find a certain column, just put them in alpha order, and then you can look for the one that you need. The last set of commands here are for pivot items. This first one will reset all of the labels. So if I had changed east to eastern, this command would reset them all to their original labels. The next command here is show items with no data. So I'm going to make a couple of layout changes to this pivot table. I'll take out category, put product above region, and we can see east and west all the way down, except cheesy. It's only in the west. It has no sales in the east, so that's no data, so it's not going to show up. We do have sales in the east for all the other products, and to keep things consistent, you can show this item with no data so that east appears, but there's just nothing beside it. I can select any item in that column and then come to pivot items, show items with no data, and now cheesy shows east, but there's no data for it. So it's a nice way to keep your layout consistent. And the next command is repeat item labels on or off. And here the headings are just once. I'm going to take out that subtotal. So here, if we want this column filled up with the product names, we just come here, repeat item labels on, and you can turn it back off when you don't need it so that it's cleaner and easier to read. And the next two are show blank items and hide blank items. To do that, I'll go back to food sales, clear that filter, and perhaps we didn't get a product name for a few of these sales. If I come back to my pivot table and refresh, now we have blank at the end. Over here, we can decide we don't really want to show those, we can hide. Then we just don't see them. And if you do want to see them, just turn that back on.